philosophers of religion. Okay, so it's going to be extremely important in the following videos. In fact, that's pretty much the only subject that I'm going to address with respect to religion, for the most part. The second view is polytheism, which is the belief in multiple divine entities. And this used to be the dominant view. For instance, the ancient animists were just profound polytheists. They, I remember one of my professors gave me just this wonderful example of ancient animism. For instance, consider the idea of the world. The world, as he pointed out, derives from the word were and eld. Eld is in old and were is in man, old man. And the reason for this is because of ancient animism. And the ancient animists, they kind of engaged in analogy and metonymy. And what they did was they had analogies of the world themselves. They basically anthropomorphized everything around them. For instance, they thought the entire world was just basically akin to an old man. The ground was his gravelly skin. The grass, his soft hair or whatnot. What was it? When the sun and the moon were his two eyes, and when you would see them in the sky together, when the sun is setting and the moon is rising, that's when his two eyes are gazing down upon you. And the great Milky Way galaxy that you can see is his spine. That's just a wonderful example of how the ancient animists would anthropomorphize the world around them. And of course this also led to the development of the belief in gods governing the world. For instance, a god governing lightning, or a god governing wealth, or a god governing produce and agriculture, and so on and so forth. So polytheism was basically the original, historically, state of primitive man, at least with respect to his religious inclinations. Now, polytheism used to be the subject of very rigorous analysis by ancient Greek and Indian philosophers, but that's mostly died out since classical theism came into prevalence. And the gods associated with polytheism are greater than humans, hence they deserve the entity, the qualification as a god, lowercase g, namely because they have fundamentally to do with the nature of the world around them, and so on and so forth, but they starkly differ from God proper, capital G, of classical theism, because there are strong elements of anthropomorphism, as I just explained briefly, present in most polytheistic beliefs, and most polytheistic religions tend to posit gods that are more human-like, less transcendent, and so on and so forth. And polytheistic gods, as you can see, just are really different from the god of classical theism. And the last position is kind of an amalgam of polytheism and monotheism. It's technically polytheistic because it posits multiple gods, okay, but it has a monotheistic slant because it says that one god in particular is more worthy of worship than others. And this god may even be extremely similar to the one found in classical theism. For instance, I remember reading this fascinating book by Mark S. Smith. I think it was the biblical text of Ugarit or something like that. I can't remember the exact name, but he proposed a pretty strong case for the idea that the ancient Israelites were henotheists, insofar as that they did believe they had the Canaanite religion with the belief in 70 gods and so on and so forth, and that Yod He Vav He, YHVH or YHWH, whichever way you transliterate it, that God itself is a sort of historical, mythological descendant of the god El, of the Ugarit pantheon, the Canaanite pantheon of gods, and so on and so forth. So the ancient Israelites could have been, in fact, a henotheistic group of people, and that may even be indicated in some portions of the Bible, for instance. So that's just one example of a henotheistic culture. Another good example comes to me. For instance, prior to the advent of Islam, the Arabians there also had a sort of minor form of henotheism. They believed in multiple gods. For instance, in the Kaaba, there were 360 idols for 360 gods. The ahadith of Muhammad provide these historical details. And of those 360 idols, I mean, it's not as if the Arabians didn't have the concept of Allah, like some divine entity, but they just seemed too far away from him. So they just focused more on their animist roots. But of course, there were some people who were monotheists or henotheists. Some were monotheists who rejected these idols and just believed in the great divine entity, and some were henotheists who accepted these idols but focused more attention on the single great divine entity, and so on and so forth. So henotheism is also was interestingly prevalent in ancient times past. And so these just comprise three positions of theism, general, really broad positions. Either there's one God, monotheism, or there's many gods, polytheism, or there's many gods, but one God's to be favored, and henotheism. And monotheism is the primary subject of study throughout most of the history of philosophy of religion. And there are basically four subdivisions to it, and I'm going to try to discuss those four. The first, the divisions would be classical theism, deism, pantheism, and panentheism. Classical theism is the extremely popular, and I must stress extremely popular, view of God that's the subject of study of virtually all of philosophy of religion, and pretty much all of my videos. In fact, I'm not really sure if I will, maybe, but I think pretty much all of my videos, in fact, are just going to focus singularly on classical theism. And it posits a God that's extremely powerful, highly knowledgeable, eternal, good, and concerned with human affairs. And the type of classical theism that's affirmed the most, there's basically two types of classical theism. The type of classical theism that's offered the most, and is also the subject of the most study in philosophy of religion, is the type that I'll just dub greater classical theism. And it doesn't just simply say that God's very powerful, it says he's maximally powerful. In other words, omnipotent, and so on and so forth. He's not just simply very knowledgeable, he's omniscient. Not just very good, but morally perfect, and so on and so forth. And this view is basically greater classical theism. And the final type of classical theism is one that's popular among theistic philosophers mostly, called Anselmian theism, after Saint Anselm of Canterbury, who was famous for his ontological argument, and that view basically says that God is a logically necessary or metaphysically necessary being. And Anselmian theism has mostly been embraced by a lot of very powerful, very sophisticated theistic philosophers. Alvin Plantinga, that's one example, one really big example actually. Thomas Morris, Alfred Freddoso, pretty much every Catholic philosopher actually, because of their belief in divine simplicity, and so on and so forth. So it's an extremely important part, and various differences and nuances in classical theism arise from debate over the attributes of God, the properties of God. For instance, does God exist in time, or is he timeless, or does God have knowledge of the future, and so on and so forth. Now, some versions of classical theism don't affirm greater classical theism, like process theology, which affirms greater classical theism, but doesn't go on to say that, for instance, God's omniscient, omnipotent, and so on and so forth. Okay, and of course that doesn't accept Anselmian and generally they don't accept Anselmian theism either.